Okay, alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism webinar series. This is the fifth webinar in the series. They were running June through December. They were originally supposed to run June through November, and hurricanes Helene and Milton had different ideas. So we've got one more webinar coming up after this one that my colleague Carolyn Kovach, who's on the chat and will be helping to moderate things, will be presenting on in December. At the same time, the second Wednesday from 7 to 8. I don't actually know. Is it the 12th, Carolyn?
It is the 11th.
The 11th. It's the second Wednesday. It's the 11th, the second Wednesday of the month in this same time frame. For those of you who haven't attended previous webinars in this series and are interested in the other topics that we've covered, the whole series is available on YouTube, as this one will be after the fact. So if I have done my calculations right and put my presentation together the right way, we should be in for about a 45-minute presentation with some time for Q&A. Carolyn, who I sort of just called upon here, is going to be monitoring the chat for questions, but there's also going to be plenty of time at the end, and we'll sort of work that out. If you have questions during, feel free to type them, and Carolyn will interrupt me if she thinks it's relevant, but if not, we'll get to everything at the end. I should also mention, for those of you who are watching in the future, and actually those who are here, we've got an evaluation for this video. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, we'll provide you the link for everything at the end. That really helps us understand the effect that these webinars have, and hopefully continue to run them. And even if you're watching on YouTube in the future, that survey should still be active. So please go ahead and look down in the comments for that link. Okay. So I'm assuming that if you guys couldn't hear or see me, that there would have been a myriad of comments at this point. So I am going to go ahead and jump in and get started with today's presentation. Share my screen here. And we'll make this full screen. Okay. Alrighty. So today we are going to be discussing Florida's red tide, which tends to be a little bit rage-provoking, a little bit of hysteria, anxiety-provoking. So, we're talking about seeing red today. However, before we get into that, I did mention earlier that this is a webinar that is put on by the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. This is a little bit of that material that's already been covered for if you've been to a few webinars already. So go ahead and go to the bathroom now if you need to. But the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism was established in 1998 to establish and maintain a professional code of ecotourism ethics in order to encourage awareness and stewardship of Florida's natural heritage. So it is a certificate program that ecotour operators can participate in and earn. And there are benefits, of course, for those ecotour operators as well as ecotourists, right? So participating businesses will receive, they receive an element of support through resources. Florida Sea goes out of their way to give that extra level of promotion and also establish a peer network so that you can, potentially work out any future issues with, like-minded parties. It also makes it easier for responsible ecotourists to target experiences that align with their values, right? So you are getting that additional level of exposure, potentially from customers who will really appreciate what services you're trying to offer them. And of course, by participating with Florida Sea, you get you get to participate in education opportunities like the one that you are currently participating in today. So I don't actually think I've said it yet, but my name is Kate Rose. It is a first name and a last name. It's not like Mary Kate. I get that a lot. And I am a Florida Sea Grant Extension agent based in Charlotte County. I currently serve on the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism board on their education subcommittee, and I share this role with a few other Sea Grant agents based in other areas around the state. We've got Carolyn Kovach, who is on the call with us right now, based in Flagler and Volusia counties, as well as Mike Sipos, who is based in Collier County. I also always like to give a little introduction as to what Florida Sea Grant is. This is actually quite funny. My grandmother is on the call right now. Hi, Mama. I tell everybody this joke because when I first told my grandmother that I got this position, she thought I was going to be a secret agent. So I always like to provide a little bit of background. And Sea Grant is a part actually of the land grant university system. And this was established in 1862 actually by Abraham Lincoln, who noticed that there was agricultural research occurring at the university level that wasn't making its way down to the end users, which at that time were producing the food for our country. So that was very important. So he targeted one university in every state who was responsible for facilitating that information exchange, making sure that the research got down to the end users. And in the state of Florida, that university is the University of Florida, and more specifically within the university, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. And in 1975, Sea Grant was established. Somebody figured out that we should have a similar system for our marine resources. So Sea Grant is sat within NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There are 35 programs, Sea Grant programs, one for every coastal state, the Great Lakes, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And then within the state of Florida, as I mentioned before, when I was introducing Carolyn and Mike as well, who are sort of my collaborators in this effort. In Florida, we are particularly we tend to be associated with our counties. So all of this to say, we have quite a few bosses. And because we are affiliated with the University of Florida, we are required to show this poster that says that we will not discriminate against anybody for any reason. And if you do, and if you feel that you have been discriminated against, we can provide the information to file a complaint. But let's get into the fun stuff now. So I thought we should start with a review of what algae is, particularly because it tends to come across people's news feeds as a harmful algal bloom. But not all algae is harmful. So algae is actually a diverse group of photosynthetic organisms. That can range from our microscopic phytoplankton. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that red tide falls into that category of microscopic later, to giant. So people who have been swimming on the West Coast at all, or might be familiar with giant kelp, is technically an algae. Sargassum, of course, which we experience a lot here in Florida, is also an algae. The thing that defines an algae is that they tend to lack the defining features of many plants. So, right, your house plant has roots and leaves and a stem, and those provide different functions for the plant. In some sense, algae is almost just kind of like an amorphous photosynthetic blob. Algae is primarily aquatic, but can actually be found in many, many environments. Some of you guys might be familiar with lichen, which is a photosynthetic, a mutualistic relationship between an algae and a fungus that sort of forms that scaly-like material on trees, but algae really can be found everywhere. And algae are actually ecologically essential. They produce a substantial amount of oxygen for our atmosphere, about 50 to 80% of it. And I feel as though that can be summed up really well in this meme that I found online, right? So trees tend to get a lot of love for producing our oxygen, and oceanic plankton, or plankton at all, particularly photosynthetic plankton, are really doing a lot of that legwork and maybe not getting quite as much of the love for it. Algae sequester carbon, that helps mitigate some of the climate change impacts we're seeing. They're a really important food web link, right? Tiny animals feed on tiny plankton, and bigger animals feed on tiny animals, all the way up to the biggest animals that there are out there. They also digest nutrients and remove pollutants from their environment. And they remove nutrients from their environment. An algal bloom occurs when there is a rapid and substantial increase in algae biomass in an aquatic system. So basically, all of the different types of algae that we just talked about, when it grows really, really, really fast, that is by definition an algal bloom. And a harmful algal bloom is a bloom that then produces some harmful effects either on human health or the aquatic ecosystems. And that can be, by producing toxins. It can be by creating low oxygen zones. So algae are plants. They do produce oxygen. But they are a living thing and can also take up oxygen. So occasionally that scale tips the opposite way and can suck oxygen out of the water so that it can't be utilized by other marine life. Harmful algal blooms can also shade out other plant organisms. In the area that I am based in Charlotte County, we are facing sort of a pretty drastic seagrass loss, and that's a result of algae blooms that are blocking out sun from those seagrass meadows. Those plants are also photosynthetic. I've heard it compared to placing a tarp on your lawn and expecting it to grow, right? The grass would die. But something that's really important to note is that not all blooms are the same. So a harmful algal bloom covers a wide variety of conditions. So they're not all the same. They can be very different species, have very different effects. And also they're not always all toxic, right? Not all algae produce toxins. So factors that might influence algal blooms, Nutrients, of course, right? You fertilize your plants the same way. Algae operates in the same way. So nutrient availability could fuel a bloom. How clear the water is. I mentioned that algae is photosynthetic. It needs to have the sunlight get through the water in order for it to grow. Water circulation patterns, basically how that algae is being moved around and how the nutrients are being moved around in an aquatic system. Hydrology, which is how the water runs off of the land, right? So that could carry potentially nutrients with it or drive circulation patterns. Climate and weather. I'm sure many of you are here because you may have noticed the association between hurricanes and a red tide bloom. And of course, ecological interactions. So people tend to think of algae as kind of a monolith, as all one thing, right? But much the way there are many different plants, there are also many different algae at play, potentially in a bloom. So now that we've covered Algae 101, what is red tide? So red tide is a bloom of the microscopic algae Corenia brevis. You could sort of see pictures here of what that looks like, both sort of up close in a microscope as well as further out. So it's a unicellular marine dinoflagellate. All that you need to know is that it's really tiny, and a dinoflagellate means that it has this really interesting swimming action, which I can actually show you in this video. So these little plant cells are actually moving around. It's not, like I said, these are pretty multifaceted creatures. Corenia brevis is one of 6 Corenia species that occur in the Gulf of Mexico. There are 12 species of Corenia globally. And of course, it produces that brevetoxin. So these species are natural to some degree in the ecosystem. They're supposed to be there. Corenia brevis, runs into issues for us, particularly when it produces that brevetoxin. And of course, that toxin can kill marine life. It can kill fish. It can kill manatees. And the thing that we tend to associate with it is it also causes respiratory irritation when it becomes aerosolized. So when we have waves that are full of red tide cells, full of Karenia brevis cells crashing on the beach, it can sort of spray up and cause a really irritating coughing symptoms. And of course, all of these things have really big impacts, right? They impact how we operate here in Southwest Florida, right? We have cleanup costs associated with removing dead fish that wash up on the beach. And all of these red tide impacts also have costs. So in order to remove fish, dead manatees, other types of debris that washes up, we're looking at almost or just over $300,000 annually to remove, and deal with some of those scenarios. Of course, potentially some of the reason that a lot of you guys are here, and the thing that we'll be focusing on for this presentation, being with the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism, is the cost of lost tourism and business. We're looking at a loss potentially of $20 million annually in the ecotourism economy. Of course, we've got human health costs associated with that, right? That coughing can be really detrimental, potentially to people who are predisposed to respiratory issues as well. And of course, there's a cost associated with that, right? If you go to the hospital, they cost money to, make sure that you get better, both for yourself, your insurance company, all of the above. So in Sarasota County alone, the 2015 to 2016 red tide cost the county up to $4 million. We have our fisheries that are negatively impacted, right? You don't want to eat fish that have come out of a red tide affected area. Although we will discuss, some safety and tips if you want to recreate while there is a red tide bloom. And of course, all of these things together, drive down coastal property value. We're potentially looking at job loss when we're looking at reduced tourism income. And so, of course, this is a really big deal, right? You guys are here because you've seen the headlines and you want to know what's up. So, algal bloom development takes place in 4 different steps, and we'll go through all of them over the course of this presentation. So, first, a bloom starts. It's initiated. Then there is the growth and the transport of that bloom. So that's when it's actually getting bigger. We have the maintenance, which tends to be where it becomes a nuisance for us, right? It's continuing to hang around and cause all of the negative impacts that we just discussed. And of course, finally, hopefully, right, we have termination. So initiation of red tide or a Karenia brevis harmful algal bloom actually starts in an area quite well named the initiation zone in the Gulf of Mexico between Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor. So this is a naturally occurring, and it tends to hang out on the west shelf of Florida. So some factors that drive initiation. So right now, there's sort of a working theory among scientists that it's a combination of 2 things that create an ideal sort of initiation for a bloom. The first step is that the iron-rich Saharan dust blows over from Africa. So for our Florida residents, you have probably noticed that, starting like late July, early August, the sky starts to get really hazy. Like it's kind of cloudy, but not really, but still really bright. And that's about that time of year where these tiny, tiny particles of iron-rich sand actually have been carried all the way over from Africa. When that dust finally settles and hits our water, it fuels a bloom, a sort of a preemptive bloom, if you will, of a species called, of an algae species called Trichodesmium. People that are from the area might know this as like marine sawdust. It kind of sits on the top of the water. It has a yellow appearance. I know when I've been boating, I've boated through it. You get that sudden sensation that you're running aground, but it's really just algae floating on top of the water. So the Saharan dust drives the Trichodesmium bloom, and the Trichodesmium has this ability to take a form of nitrogen that's really, really hard to digest for Karenia brevis and turn it into a much more easily digestible form. So it's basically creating food for the Karenia brevis. And by the way, this sort of explains that timing, right? Red tide season, quote unquote, although of course there's lots of factors that can drive different conditions and different times of the year can suffer blooms. We'll discuss all of that, but all factors considered, red tide tends to appear sort of late summer, early fall, and tends to finally cease when the water gets cold. Karenia brevis does not like cold water. Okay, so we've covered initiation. Next step is our growth and transports. We have a sort of spike in our Karenia brevis cells. And now we are beyond it, that sort of background presence of it, because Karenia brevis is naturally occurring. Next is that growth and transport phase. This is where it starts to become potentially a real issue for us. So when we're looking at growth and transport, we've got upwelling that potentially brings the red tide cells up into the nearshore environment. So red tide can actually start fairly deep, but we get that upwelling, which provides more nutrients for the algae and also moves it inshore. And we're thinking, and by we, I mean the scientists tend to think that this upwelling might actually be influenced by the placement of the loop current. So before we get into the loop current, we're going to talk about it. We'll talk a little bit about upwelling. So in general, deeper, colder water tends to have more nutrients in it. There's less life down there to sort of suck it all up. And you can see from this image that not only are those nutrients coming to the surface, potentially feeding those phytoplankton, plant plankton, and zooplankton, also the little tiny animals that live there, but it's also moving onshore, right? Just based on the way that the winds move around the planet. And before I move on to my next step here, I do also want to note, while we're discussing red tide growth, that nitrogen is the thing that fuels red tide blooms, not phosphorus. When there was a really bad bloom, of course, between 2017 and 2018, that coincided with some cyanobacteria blooms in the Caloosahatchee. There was lots of discussion about whether or not the phosphate mining operations in this area, and by this area, I mean Southwest Florida, where I'm based, were contributing to that. And that's actually not the case. So nitrogen is the limiting nutrient in a marine system. So a limiting nutrient, we're going to pretend we're making cookies, right? You've always got flour and sugar and butter on hand because they keep for a pretty long time. Maybe you don't always have eggs around. So if you have a recipe that calls for 2 eggs, but you only have 1 in your fridge, you're going to half your recipe. So you're going to have less cookies. Basically introducing a limiting nutrient, assuming you're going to make as many cookies as you possibly can. If you go out and buy a dozen eggs, you're going to have a lot more cookies. And that's the way nitrogen reacts in this system, right? It's effectively the eggs in that analogy. So I mentioned before that some of this upwelling is driven by the loop current. So for those of you that may not be familiar, the Gulf of Mexico actually has this current, aptly named because it's kind of just this like little loop-de-loop that goes, sort of up and around clockwise through the Gulf of Mexico. Occasionally that loop pinches off and creates that loop eddy here that you see in the image to the left, just creates this little whirlpool. But for reasons that are sort of unknown, the loop current tends to move back and forth. So that loop, sort of that orange structure in that image, sometimes it's a little bit closer to Florida, and sometimes it's a little bit closer to Mexico and Texas. And there's some evidence that when it moves closer to Florida, that there's this kind of inflection point off of the dry tortugas, which you can see here on this image on the left is sort of just to the west of the Keys. And what happens when the loop current moves closer to Florida is it sets the whole West Florida shelf into a little bit of jostling chaos. Think about, like shaking a water bottle. That's effectively what happens, and it sort of drives that upwelling and might have an impact on the growth and transport of a bloom. So, when we're looking at bloom development, right now we've covered two stages of bloom development that we as humans have no control over. Luckily, we have gotten pretty good because we've had so much experience with red tide, because it has been naturally occurring for so long, with coming up with tools to help us live with it, right? Because there's a really big portion of this process of red tide that we can't control. It's just going to happen. It is a naturally occurring event. So, much the way that we have learned to live with hurricanes, right? There have been developments in monitoring and forecasting that help us make decisions on how we're going to live with this event, right? You go to the National Hurricane Center, or maybe you go to Mike's weather page when you're tracking a storm. Similar tools actually now exist for red tide. So the first, I guess not the first, these aren't presented in any particular order, but one of the tools that you could use is the FWC Red Tide Current Status webpage. It provides a summary basically of red tide and what's going on. Oh, I see a few. Oh, Carolyn's in the chat. Perfect. Thank you. So you can use this QR code or check this link, and this will take you to a page that has a link to this map. Here, I couldn't include the legend on this map, but if you look here closely at the west coast of Florida, you'll see a few yellow and orange dots. Yes, this screenshot is actually from this morning, so you're getting a pretty good idea as to what is currently going on in the state. But basically, it uses a stoplight system to indicate how severe a bloom is, or how many red tide cells, Karenia brevis cells, are present in that sample. There's also the Moat Beaches, the Moat Beach Conditions Reporting System. So Moat actually utilizes volunteers to go check on the status of beaches. They'll report on a lot of things like surf, but they'll also report on whether or not they're experiencing any red tide irritation. So that's definitely worth checking out if you want to go to the beach and you know that there is a red tide bloom in the area. Red tide, the effects of it, while they're widespread and they should definitely be taken seriously, tend to be pretty localized. I think people tend to get very flummoxed when they hear that there's a red tide and they feel like paralyzed, like they can't go anywhere near the water. And that's simply not the case. I mean, you might experience impacts in one area and you might not in another. I had my aunt come to visit me last year from California, and she was like, "How will we know if the red tide is there?" And I said, "If we go to the beach." And I said, "First of all, I've checked the forecast. It's not there. And second of all, if you get out and you cough, we'll just get back in the car and go home." And we'll talk a little bit about those health impacts in a second. There's also another resource, the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System, which basically sort of combines the previous two resources. And that basically will account for how severe a red tide is and partner it effectively with the weather conditions to generate a forecast for about 48 hours forward. So you can estimate the risk of the location you're trying to go to, whether or not you will experience effects of red tide where you'd like to go. Of course, there are a few more factors associated with red tide impacts, right? So I mentioned before, respiratory irritation. In order to avoid that, I just gave you 3 forecasting tools that you could use potentially to avoid unnecessary exposure. And like I said, if you get out of the car at the beach, you weren't expecting any symptoms, and you start to experience symptoms, get back in your car and move away from it. Easy as that. You should start to feel much better as soon as you get some clean, non-brevetoxin occluded air in your lungs. All right, but what about seafood, right? People come to Florida for the seafood. So luckily for us, because there are similar resources to whether or not you should be harvesting fish as there are to whether or not there's going to be a respiratory whether or not there's going to be any respiratory irritation. So, and the organizations that run that are really heavily regulated organizations. We're talking about, FDACs. So, commercially available seafood, as well as, seafood from hotels, grocery stores, and restaurants, that should all be safe because that's all really heavily regulated. However, if you are fishing, you want to go fishing, or if you're an eco tour operator, you may not fish, but potentially you have people who have come down here to fish and they're asking what they should do. There's lots of guidelines out there, and I've summarized them here. First of all, avoid fishing in a red tide bloom. I just talked about how some of the the effects of red tide can be pretty localized. If you're fishing in water that is discolored where you're coughing, you don't want to fish there. You're exposing yourself to conditions that are not healthy, and the fish that you pull out are certainly not going to be healthy. That being said, if you decide to go out and go fishing and you're going to avoid that area that's affected by the bloom, don't take any visibly stressed or dead fish. At best, those fish have not been killed by red tide, but they're potentially decomposing and they've got some bacteria on them that is not going to be good for you. At worst, they're going to be contaminated with toxin. And by the way, cooking it or freezing it will not deactivate that toxin. So really make sure you follow these guidelines. The Florida Department of Health recommends that if you do go fishing in an area that isn't affected by red tide, while red tide is simply, present in the ether, let's say you're, many miles north or south or east or west of it, and you catch a healthy fish, the Florida Department of Health still recommends rinsing your fish fillets with fresh water just for safety. And of course, continue to monitor those FDACS guidelines. If they have closed down shellfish harvesting in your area, that not only applies to commercial organizations, but will also apply to you. FWC will also put out anything of notice. So, right, we just talked about how you can eat fish in the right conditions, but if for some reason conditions worsen or that becomes unsafe, FWC will put out the all call and basically tell you yes or no and some guidelines on how to avoid that. Regardless of whether or not you're a fisher or you're just recreating in your coastal environment, you can actually help. You can help, the people around you by utilizing the FWC Fish Kill Hotline. And as of recently, any data that you report to the FWC Fish Kill Hotline is actually being used to more effectively manage fisheries. So there's some researchers at the University of Florida who are taking that data and incorporating it into the models, into the population that they models, in the population models that they use to manage a fishery, basically to decide whether or not you can fish, right? And on top of that, as I mentioned, if you report a fish kill, then something can be done about that fish kill. It can be removed so it doesn't continue to pose a health issue to anybody else that might come across it. And I should also mention, I've put up a lot of QR codes and links. Anybody that is present today on this presentation is going to get a follow-up email with a link to that survey that I mentioned we'll give at the end, as well as a link to all of these resources that you can physically click on if you've missed the QR code. Okay, so we've just talked about all of the things that we don't seem to have any influence on in the bloom formation process for red tide. Now, looking at maintenance. So first of all, there's an element of maintenance is a little bit more bloom maintenance is a little bit more multifaceted. So we just talked about a bunch of features that we don't have control over. One of the features of maintenance that we continue to not have control over is these fish kills. So I mentioned the fact that you can report to the FWC Fish Kill Hotline so that fish can be removed from coastal areas. That is good because you don't want a bunch of stinky dead fish there. It also poses a health issue as those fish potentially start to decompose on the beach and they're floating. But the other reason that municipalities remove those fish is because with the fish in the water, they decompose and continue to fuel the bloom. It becomes this really nasty feedback loop that can prolong a bloom for a really long time. We don't have a ton of control over that. But there is evidence that demonstrates that once a bloom makes its way inshore, that we as humans have created a really nutrient and nitrogen rich inshore environment. So we don't have control over how the bloom develops, but once it gets close to us, because we put so much, because we put so many nutrients in our water, we're potentially exacerbating the issue, prolonging the life of the bloom. And of course, that nutrient rich inshore environment can be exacerbated by hurricanes, right? So hurricanes, they drop a lot of rainwater. We get that rainwater then runs off into the ocean and it carries lots of nutrients with it. Potentially septic tanks are overflowing, sewer lines are disrupting, right? So on a good day, humans are introducing a fair amount of nutrients into the water. And on bad days, we've got things like hurricanes that make the issue even worse. And that brings us to termination. And unfortunately, that is the phase that we know the least about. I mentioned earlier that we know that red tide doesn't really seem to like cold waters. That being said, the 2017 to 2018 red tide bloom lasted the whole year through the water. So conditions can really vary. But we're not sitting on our laurels here. The Florida Red Tide Mitigation and Technology Development Initiative, it's a partnership between FWC and Mote Marine Laboratory. It's funded by the state to investigate, control, and mitigation efforts. Mitigation being, reducing the impacts of red tide, and control being, can we actually physically do something to reduce the size and the length of this bloom? So we've talked a little bit about mitigation and avoidance, right? Some of those tools that I provided. When we're discussing control, there are lots of different products and strategies being researched out there, but all in all, they can sort of be clumped into three different categories. You have your chemical control, your biological control, and your physical control. Chemical control, perhaps pretty intuitive, effectively an herbicide, right? The same thing that you spray on your weeds in your lawn. There's lots of considerations that have to be taken as far as applying those things in the water. Will it affect other species negatively? Will the herbicide even stay with the bloom if the waves and the wind are pushing it around? Biological control is using more nature-based solutions. So that could be things like installing a living shoreline to or any other sort of plants to help mitigate the nutrients that are available for the red tide, but could also be things like using biological compounds as an herbicide. So there's been some discussion of moat as about using bacteria that specifically target or they eat it. Like I said, right, this is a whole ecosystem here. So there's certain types of bacteria that will sort of biologically control just naturally because that's what they're supposed to do, will sort of help keep the Corenia brevis population down. Physical control is things like, filtering the water. There's also lots of interest in potentially using bubble nets. So by basically pumping gas, typically it's air, sometimes it can be ozone, and then you get that 1-2 punch of the chemical and the physical. But basically, you blow a bunch of bubbles in the water and you create this curtain to sort of maroon the red tide so that it can't continue to spread and develop. However, and all of these things are really great efforts to sort of help us mitigate the impacts of them, right? But none of these things are going to be the thing that make red tide easier to live with, or potentially easier to live with. But there's no such thing as a silver bullet. It's not going to make the red tide go away. All of these things are tools in the toolbox. Not one of them is the single solution to getting rid of red tide, particularly because red tide is naturally occurring. So that being said, what can you guys do as potentially eco tour operators as well as eco tourists? If you're an eco tour operator, you can take this opportunity to educate your customers. right? So you can provide them information to keep your customers safe and calm. I've provided you guys this information. Even if you're not an eco-tour operator, I highly recommend that you utilize them and spread them as much as possible, right? And a lot because that helps avoid this hysteria that surrounds red tide, and that's good for nobody. We want people coming into this area, utilizing our businesses and spending their money to some degree, right? So if we can help avoid the hysteria, here's this tool that you can utilize to make sure that you stay safe and you don't have a bad experience when you come to visit us. You could also potentially capitalize on an opportunity for personal reflection. So you can do this exercise yourself, or you can encourage your customers to do it if you're an eco tour operator. But are you or your customers doing everything that they can to reduce nutrient loading, to make sure that when the Karenia brevis reaches that inshore environment, that it's not going to stick around for very long or continue to be a nuisance to us? And, you can recommend things like making sure that they're implementing Florida-friendly landscaping principles, utilizing fertilizer less, planting plants that require less fertilizer, as well as, do they have a septic tank? Are they properly maintaining that septic tank? Should they consider hooking up to sewer, particularly, right? My area of Southwest Florida, we had two hurricanes in a month, right? That's really the 1-2 punch on those systems. It can be really stressful. So take the opportunity, first of all, to combat the hysteria with some of this education, and also reflect on what you are doing and can do to sort of help mitigate some of these impacts. And with that, we finally come to the question portion of our evening. Carolyn is going to, hopefully, I assume she is going to put the link for the survey into this chat. You can also get it on the QR code. Thank you all for coming. You're welcome to stick around for any questions. I'm happy to answer for everybody. And again, I highly recommend that you guys tune in to Carolyn's talk on December 11th, the same time, 7 to 8, and that'll be specifically on corals in Florida. All right. Thank you guys for sticking around. Let me check out this chat preview. Thanks, guys. Checking the chat here. Oops. Going a little too far. Thoughts, feelings, questions? Yes, Carolyn, thank you for specifying. You guys are welcome to turn on your microphone and or your camera. You should be able to speak out, or you could put it any questions you have in the chat if you'd like. Or maybe everybody's been doing us a huge favor in doing that survey, which we really appreciate.
Well, thank you, Kate. I learned a few new things, actually. I'm glad I haven't had to deal with red tide over on my coast, but I did experience it one year when I was doing an internship on Sanibel, and I remember walking out on the beach and there were waves, which was also unusual for there, and just immediately coughing. But yeah, as soon as I left the beach and went back to my house, I was fine. But that was my one experience with it, and I'm thankful I haven't had to deal with it, but it's definitely good to know about.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I had that experience with my aunt. I guess, she's from California, and I can't speak to the science of sort of what she was discussing, but she sort of suggested that there were these areas where you could go and there was an algae bloom that were like super harmful, and you couldn't tell that you had been exposed to them until after the fact, and then it was like catastrophic, like pets were dying. And I was like, no, it's not quite like that here. You just get away from it and everything sort of clears itself out. And Roger actually asked a pretty technical question on, is the toxin only inside the algae cell and needs wind to break the cell wall and release the toxin? Yes. So Roger, you have it. I'm pretty sure exactly right. So the toxin exists within the algae cell. Algae tend to be pretty short-lived organisms. And what happens is when they die, their cells lice is the technical term, but basically they bust open and release the toxin into the environment. And this happens, many, many times in a bloom and creates that toxic environment. It's one of the things that has to be considered when they're working on chemical control, right? Potentially because you can't just kill the red tide cells because then you'll be left and stuck with the toxin as well. And the way that aerosolization process works is the wind and wave action kind of works twofold. One, right, it can have that impact of lysing cells, of effectively popping them, but it also creates these little misty particles, right? I mean, even when there's not red tide and you're standing on a beach, you feel the mist on your face, right? And the red tide toxin attaches itself to those water or salt particles. And occasionally they can drift really far based on the wind, based on the wind. But in theory, if you were standing really, really still inside of an algae bloom and had disturbed no water to get there, you wouldn't necessarily, and there were no algae cells dying of natural cause, you would be quote unquote safe. Or you wouldn't have that toxin exposure. I hope that makes sense, Roger. Red tide is worsened by chemical. Anna asked a question. I hear that red tide is worsened by chemicals being dumped from further north into our waters, fertilizer, mainly from agriculture. Is that true? In principle, and yes, because nutrients are the things that are sort of driving these blooms to be prolonged and to be more intense in our inshore environment. That being said, the science isn't actually there yet to demonstrate. Actually, I lied. I'm sorry. I'm recalling some preliminary work from a study. So in the Peace River system, so I'm in Charlotte Harbor, we're at the base of the Peace River. There is some preliminary work that demonstrates that mining and agriculture are contributing to an increased nutrient output. These are all based on very sophisticated computer and physics models that, quite frankly, I don't understand, but I trust the scientists. So there's evidence that though that agriculture is contributing to that nutrient-enriched environment. However, in that study, there wasn't actually enough information to demonstrate that urban areas don't contribute as well. So I think it's a if you can try to avoid placing the blame on any one thing, because in general, non-point source solution, so basically pollution where you can't point to it and say that's where it's coming from, tends to drive that nutrient enriched in water environment. So I think the general consensus is yes, agriculture contributes to that, but so do your lawn fertilizers. And there's not really been any science to differentiate between how much each of those things are contributing just yet. Yeah, you're welcome. And alrighty. Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for coming. And like I said, please help us out, take that survey, and feel free to tune in to Carolyn's, the last but certainly not least, webinar of the year on corals on December 11th. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kate.
Now I just have to figure out how to stop recording.